All right, everyone, welcome back to the Ravit Show. Today's conversation is right at the center of where data and AI are actually meeting real world use. I'm joined by Pete Johnson, Field CTO for AI at MongoDB. Pete works closely with customers, developers, and enterprise teams, helping them understand how to build real AI powered application, not demos, not slides, but production systems. We're going to talk about what the role of Field CTO for AI really means, how MongoDB sees the intersection of data and AI, what recent announcements you all have made, Pete. So I'm kind of curious to know about that as well, and how builders should think about AI in 2026. So without any further ado, let's get into it. Pete, first of all, welcome to the Ravit Show. It's your debut.
Thank you so much for having me. Excited to have this conversation. Yeah, let's get started.
Awesome. Pete, just for our audience, before we get into all the discussion, this is your first time on the show. For those who may not know you, tell us who you are and what a Field CTO for AI actually does day to day. Kind of curious to know a little bit.
Yeah, the way I always introduce myself to people is I wrote my first line of code as a sixth grader in 1981. For Christmas that year, I asked for an Intellivision, which if you know your old school home video game systems, the Intellivision was trying to challenge the Atari 2600. I asked for an Intellivision, but what I received was a TRS-80 color computer. And I used that to write a little program in BASIC that tracked the rebounding and scoring statistics for my sixth grade basketball team. It had 4K of memory. It had audio cassette tape for storage. And I'm one of those lucky people that took a childhood hobby and made it what's now a 30+ year career in tech.
I love it. I love the backstory, and obviously everything comes with an experience. And I'm kind of, obviously wanting to learn more about, obviously the last 30 years. But, obviously on our show, the Ravit Show, we have focused a lot on data and AI. And, when we talk about data and AI, there's obviously an intersection that we always look out for. From your perspective, what does that intersection really mean for MongoDB today? And in general, from your conversations with, obviously with these enterprise leaders, with developers, what do you constantly hear?
Yeah, so I spend my time talking to executives at a pretty wide variety of different customers across different segments and what they're trying to do with AI, the problems they're trying to solve. I'll talk to analysts. And then I spend a lot of time doing research on my own and creating original content, typically on LinkedIn, but other social media places, just, even if it's not necessarily, hey, here's what Mongo's doing, but here's what's going on generally with AI in the marketplace right now. So that's typically how I spend my time. But when you talk about that intersection of data and AI is still a garbage in, garbage out proposition. If you've got bad data and you put it into an AI system, you're going to have bad results.
Right.
When I talk to IT decision makers, what I typically tell them is there's no SKU for AI. There's not like one purchase you go make and now I've solved my AI problem, right? What I typically tell them is start with some business problem you already have. So look at, what are your top 10, 15 business problems? And out of those, what do you have good data for? And then of the ones you have good data for, what do you then have good metrics? So that when you apply an AI solution, you can then determine what's improved and make some kind of ROI calculation. So at a high level, that's typically what we talk about. And when we talk to practitioners and developers and writing code, it gets a little different when we talk about that intersection of AI and data. But first, when we talk to the IT decision makers, that's typically what we talk about is that problem, data, metrics.
Yeah, I love it. When we kind of, obviously, first things first, you mentioned about, obviously, bad data will give you bad output when you kind of even, obviously using it for AI use cases or AI applications. And that's what I've been kind of, obviously hearing a lot from the enterprise leaders as well is, Robert, maybe in the first 2.5 years of AI, we were just planning to focus a lot on AI and the applications. And then suddenly we started realizing that, oh, we need to also fix the original problem that we've been fixing for years, which is data quality. And that plays a very important role. I think those are fantastic insights that you shared, Pete. I'm kind of also wanting to touch a little bit on the recent announcements that you all made. You all had this huge conference in San Francisco on Jan 15th, and you all, obviously shared some amazing announcements. I know you had 2 talks there, which went very well. So congratulations on that. And
Thank you.
I'm obviously curious to learn from your role, which of these should builders and enterprises actually pay attention to and why? So tell us a little bit about the announcements, and then we can talk a little bit about the builders and the enterprises actually.
Sure. So the core announcements that you're talking about were primarily around the Voyage 4 family of models.
Yes.
And if you put that into context, I kind of think of it as 2022, 23 was the first time we started had wide use of LLMs in some way.
Right.
You take a query, you put it into a context window, the LLM consumes that, you get some answer. And the limitation with that was you can only get answers up until the point where the knowledge cutoff is for whatever the training data set was for the LLM. Yes. Then in 2024, we started using RAG widespread, where you take a vector search, you take some of your own unstructured documents, you put them into a vector database, and prior to taking the query and putting it in the context window, you do a vector search first, you get related data that you've put in there, your proprietary data, that gets added to the context window along with the query and then sent to the LLM. And that's how you can customize what the LLM comes back with in a way that doesn't require an expensive training cycle or doesn't require fine tuning. So RAG was a lower cost, more cost-effective way to inject proprietary corporate data into an LLM without the security risk of the training data getting mixed or without having to go through the expense. So with that as background, vector search ends up being a really important part of that. And if you go down into the levels, and my first, my big talk at sf.local was about sort of the 5 decisions that a developer has to make when they create a vector search and what do they go through with the embeddings. So we've got a brand new set of embedding and brand new set of embedding models from the Voyage family, and there's 2 features that I really like about the new set. Number one is instead of having to go to the Voyage website and get your API key there, that's now integrated into Atlas. So you can go into your Atlas login, and there's a new location where you can go and provision some API keys to then talk to all the Voyage models and do so through a MongoDB API endpoint instead of what's now the legacy Voyage API endpoint. So it's the first step in sort of integrating the 2 products. So that's one of my favorites. But my other favorite is the new family of models has what we're calling shared embedding spaces. So what that means is you can embed your corpus of data and put it into an attribute in your document, which is how you do it in MongoDB. You can do that with, say, the large version of the model. But then when you're developing your application code, you can use the open weight. So one of the brand new features is there's now an open weight version of the Voyage 4 family of models. And you could run that locally so that you're not incurring API token fees while you're going through your application development. So that that concept of shared embedding spaces makes it so that if you generate embeddings with one model, they're now compatible with all the other models that are in the family. And that's brand new. No other vendor does that.
No, I love those announcements, and something which is unique for obviously the builders out there, for the developers and for the enterprises. How do you think builders should be thinking about it, and how do you think the enterprise should be paying attention to these announcements? Any thoughts around that?
Yeah, I think when you think about what's a good vector search? What criteria do you use to measure a good vector search? And I think it contains 3 criteria. Number one, better quality. So am I
Right.
getting the right content back when I do that vector search? This is really important for RAG. It's equally important. Increasingly, people are using vector search for agentic memory in addition to using it for unstructured data for RAG. So retrieval quality is criteria number one. Criteria number
Nice.
two is storage. So how much storage space, and I'm not just talking about disk space, but I'm talking about the index and memory as well.
Yes.
You typically have to balance when you do things like chunk size and number of dimensions and quantization. You're making a trade-off between retrieval quality and storage size, typically. But the third thing that people miss is developer friction. So how easy is it to learn how to do this? And how much time does it take even a well-practiced person who knows how to do it? How many iterations and how long are those iterations? I think, one of my jokes, I've been in this role here for about 7 months now. And I always say there's two kinds of developers. There's developers that love MongoDB and there's developers who haven't tried MongoDB yet.
Nice.
So it's a core part of our methodology to try to make the friction for developers as low as possible so that you can focus on your business logic, you can focus on your other things, and we're bringing that same sensibility to the embeddings and the vector search. So this shared spaces that I just talked about, this makes it easier on the developer, so I can run the Nano locally, and while I'm doing my application development, I don't have to worry because the embeddings that I've generated with the bigger models on my data set, they're going to be compatible with one another. There's lots of other examples within our ecosystem that were part of my talk. And as you know, because I gave you a preview, if you weren't there for my talk, I dropped a comic book version of it on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
So you can look through that sort of thing. But we do some really cool things with chunking size. We do some cool things with how you deal with the number of dimensions. Again, trying to reduce the amount of friction that a developer has to deal with as they're trying to implement this.
Yeah, I love it. I love these insights, and it's going to stay with me as well. Pete, what you mentioned is like either developers love MongoDB or either they haven't tried it. So next time when I talk to any developer who asks me about MongoDB, maybe he hasn't ever tried it. So that's why they're asking about it. But Pete, since you talk to in your role, obviously you spend a lot of time with customers, obviously also with enterprise leaders out there. Based on what you are seeing on the ground, what advice would you give organizations that are, obviously trying to navigate data and AI in 2026 without overcomplicating things? What would it be?
Well, as I said a minute ago, I would start with good problems. Like we're to the point where like science experiments don't cut it anymore. Science experiments that you can't then make a direct tie to some kind of return on investment. You're not going to get that funded in 2026, where maybe you did get it funded in 2024 or even 2025. So like I said, I would go with that methodology of what are your problems, what are your data, what are your metrics. Start there. Don't start with the tool. Don't start with the solution. Start with the problem.
Nice.
And then what you see very quickly is it's easy. It's relatively easy now. Anybody can go pick a framework, whether it's LangGraph or Llama Index or any of those, and with some vibe coding, you can create a pretty simple agent in a couple hours, right? But then now what? How do you make that enterprise, right? So how do you make it so that it can handle changes in data? How do you make it so that it can handle traffic spikes? How do you make it so that if your users are one place and your data is a second place and your model's a third place, how do you manage latency with all that? And that's why we feel like we're really well positioned to help developers in this market, because as I think Atlas is now 75% of our revenue and growing. And one of the reasons that's so popular is you can deploy an instance of MongoDB through the Atlas console in any hyperscaler data center you want. So we can put that close to your compute. We can put that close to your existing data. We can put that close to whatever LLM you might be using for your agent. We can put that as close to that as you'd like.
Love it.
And Atlas in the base product already has the ability to auto scale and handle those traffic spikes. So it's those combinations of things, and these new features that we're seeing with the Voyage AI models. We feel like that combination of things really makes it attractive for developers with that low friction, to use that to take on vector search.
Yeah, I love those insights, Pete. And 75% of the revenue just from Atlas is huge. It kind of also validates a lot of things for the enterprises out there, for the developers out there, and also internally at MongoDB. If obviously why Atlas is working, and you all are nonstop as well in terms of the announcements, and obviously making sure that there are newer features that are always coming up when we're talking about Voyage as well. So, which makes it super interesting for obviously the builders, the developers, and also the enterprises out there. One last question that I have for you, Pete, is around the future of the future. How do you see, like, in 2026? I'm not going to ask like 2 to 3 years from now, but maybe in the next 8 to 12 months.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts in terms of how AI will be moving, and what should we be expecting in terms of AI? Because what I've seen in the last 2 years, 2024, 2025 year, was more on the side where AI was in the experimentation phase. Everyone was trying to obviously get into the production, and there were a lot of projects which were tried and tested, lots of projects which were failed. Obviously we all have read the MIT report, and which said X number of projects, X percentage of the projects were failed. But how do you see the future of AI in next 8 to 12 months?
Yeah. Well, a couple of things. So if I'm a developer sitting in an enterprise somewhere and I haven't tried AI yet, if I'm starting at ground zero, I would not worry yet. The way that one of our executives put it to me was like, I turned 56 next in about 40 days. And like I said, I've been coding since I was 11. So I've been doing this a long time.
Wow. Yeah.
And one of our executives said to me, remember when JavaScript came out? And it gave you a way to manipulate the DOM inside the browser and do all kinds of cool UI things. But then jQuery came out, and everybody quit using raw JavaScript because it was an aggregation that made it way easier to use, and suddenly more people were doing things to manipulate the DOM. But now we've got Angular and React, and nobody really works even with jQuery anymore because we've got even a further abstraction that's made it even easier to build JavaScript-based web applications that are running in the browser. When it comes to AI, we're a lot closer to the raw JavaScript than we are to the Angular and React. So there's still time to learn this. And that's why the developer friction and sort of lowering the learning curve. One of the things I tell executives all the time is more people will develop new agents and more AI applications in the next 3 years than we've had in the prior 3 years. And in order to do that, you have to make it more approachable. You have to lower that learning curve, make it easier. You have to make it so that the cycle time is shrunk so that it's easier to do. And this has been a big part of what we've been doing with things like, we just announced in community auto embedding is now in preview in Community Edition. So that's the concept of I can embed my data. And typically in MongoDB, you have a set of data. You add an attribute for your embeddings. That's just an array of 32-bit floating point numbers. That is what gets generated when you take your content and you put it through the embedding model. But what happens when the original data changes? Well, should you have to figure out how to do a trigger and how to re-embed that? So what we've been in preview for Atlas for that for a little while. We're now in preview with Community Edition. So that's the open source version. And that's an example of trying to make it easier. I shouldn't have to track every time my data changes. How do I go through the process of re-embedding? That should just be part of the platform. And that's what we're trying to do to make these things easier. So if I haven't done this before, if you're at ground zero and you haven't started yet, there's still time to do this. The other thing I would say is, if you're worried about like the vibe coding revolution and that taking away jobs and those sorts of things, take the time to go watch Werner Vogel's keynote from reInvent. It's an hour and 15 minutes. It's worth your time. He talks about how we're sort of at the precipice of renaissance in software engineering, and he lays out 5 steps for what you can do as a developer to best prepare yourself for that. And that, just as a short version, not to go into each one in details, it's remaining curious. It's focus on being a good communicator, own the data, or own the code that you spit out. Even if you vibe coded it, like, you're still responsible for it.
Right.
Think in systems, and think, as he used the word polymath, which is this idea of like a T or pie-shaped engineer, where you might be an expert, deep dive expert in 1 or 2 things, but you know a lot. There's a lot that you know a little bit about, and it forms either the letter T or the letter pi. So like I said, it's worth your time to go watch that for 75 minutes. I found it very inspirational, and I think it sets up software engineering is going to be one of the first jobs impacted by this AI revolution, and that's how you can best prepare yourself for it. Go watch what Werner has to say about that.
Yeah, I love it. I love, Pete, what you mentioned about, obviously, first of all, even if you haven't started, there's still time to start. You're never late to the train, to catch the train. I feel it's about, obviously those 5 principles that you mentioned from the keynote. I feel that is so true in terms of, because I've been asked quite a lot of times as well, will I be replaced by these vibe coding tools as well? And I'm like, no way. If you know how to do a little bit of everything in each way possible, you'll never be replaced. You'll just become much more smarter. Your work will become faster. And I think a lot of those things that you mentioned, or you also mentioned about how MongoDB is kind of making it easier for, obviously the developers, the AI engineers as well, who are kind of working on different projects with all the embeddings features that you all have been, working on. And, obviously you all are keeping it open source as well. So it just makes the life of these developers easier. So I'm excited what's going to come in the next 8 to 12 months. I know we'll keep this conversation going, Pete, and I can't wait to obviously catch up with you in person and have a lot more discussion, much more deeper discussion. But congratulations on all the great announcements that you all just made at this event in San Francisco. And I can't wait to chat more. But also, I really appreciate you breaking down what actually matters when it comes to data, AI, building systems that work in real world as well. And definitely looking for a 2.0 session on the Ravit Show very soon.
Thanks so much for having me. Good conversation. Look forward to having more.
Awesome. This is great. For those who wish to connect with Pete, I think Pete is very active on LinkedIn, and you can follow him. You can obviously follow all the great content that he kind of posts on LinkedIn. But stay tuned for more conversation with leaders like Pete and practitioners coming up in 2026. Pete, once again, thanks for visiting the Ravit Show.
Thank you.